Westminster Shorter Catechism, questions 39 to 42. What is the duty which God requireth of man? The duty which God requireth of man is obedience to his revealed will. What did God at first reveal to man for the rule of his obedience? The rule which God at first revealed to man for his obedience was the moral law. Question 41. Wherein is the moral law summarily comprehended? The moral law is summarily comprehended in the Ten Commandments. 42. What is the sum of the Ten Commandments? The sum of the Ten Commandments is to love the Lord our God with all our heart, with all our soul, with all our strength, and with all our mind, and our neighbor as ourselves. Well, welcome to the second part of our series in the Shorter Catechism. In the first part, which consisted of questions 1 to 38, we surveyed the system of Christian doctrine. Now we turn to the subject of Christian ethics. For questions 39 to the end of the Catechism, we have here what is to do with the duty that God requires of man. You may recall question 3 of the Catechism, which asks, what do the Scriptures principally teach? And the answer is what man is to believe concerning God, and that was covered in questions 1 to 38. And now, questions 39 to 107, what duty God requires of man. So in this second part, we will only cover a third of what God requires of man. For questions 39 to 107 cover 3 types of duties required of man. The first is the moral law, questions 39 to 83. Then, escaping God's wrath, which is questions 84 to 97. And then finally, how to pray, questions 98 to 107. But in this part, we're going to cover just the moral law. And in the third part, when we get to the point of escaping God's wrath, we will cover the means of grace. And then finally, of course, covering the topic of prayer. But for now, let's turn to man's duty. Notice that man's duty is to obey God's revealed will. It is important to note that obedience is to God's revealed will. Deuteronomy 29:29 says this, "The secret things belong to the Lord our God, but the things that are revealed belong to us and our children forever, that we may do all the words of this law." We are not obligated to know God's eternal will. That's something that none of us can know as mere creatures. We're not to speculate or look into his eternal decree. We can't know that. But we are obligated to know and to practice his revealed will. So where do we find his revealed will first of all? Well, God's revealed will is found in the moral law. But where do we find the moral law? We first find it in nature. Romans chapter 2, verses 14 through 15. "For when Gentiles who do not have the law, by nature do what the law requires, they are a law to themselves, even though they do not have the law. They show that the work of the law is written on their hearts." All people have the righteous requirements of the law revealed to them and even in them. In this way, no one has an excuse for their rebellion against God or their sin. Even if a person never saw a Bible in their lives, they are still without excuse for their sin. They know God's moral law because it's revealed to them by nature. It's revealed in them by nature. But also God has revealed his moral law to man in the very beginning in the form of special revelation as well. The moral law is revealed in the covenant that God made with Adam in the beginning. The law is an indispensable part of what we have called before in previous lessons, the covenant of works. Obedience was the condition of the covenant and a condition for the covenant's reward, namely eternal communion and fellowship with God. Genesis chapter 2, verse 17 tells us, "But of the tree of the knowledge of good and evil you shall not eat, for in the day that you eat of it, you shall surely die." Of course, God gave other commands in addition to this one not to eat of the tree of the knowledge of good and evil. Adam, for example, was told in Genesis chapter 2, verse 15, that he was to work and he was to guard the garden. And so in these commands, the command to work the fields and to guard the garden, as well as to not eat of the tree of the knowledge of good and evil, constitute the moral law. The moral law is contained in these commandments as a microcosm of the whole of the moral law. But the law given in the garden under the covenant of works would not go away after the fall. God does not lose his moral character after all, nor does he cease to require perfect obedience to his revealed will. It is still a requirement of his creatures that they obey him. And so his moral law is revealed continually, even after the fall. Nature is always bearing witness to it, of course. But the moral law is summarized for us in the form of special revelation in a new form in the Mosaic administration of the covenant of grace. And there, in the Mosaic administration of the covenant of grace, there in the Ten Commandments, we have a summary of the righteous requirements of God, oftentimes called the Decalogue or the 10 words. This time, however, the words come to us, the commandment comes to us, the law comes to us in the context of the covenant of grace. That means the law is not given here in the Mosaic administration as a means for Israel to obey the covenant of works. The law is not given here as a means for Israel to somehow gain a heavenly reward by virtue of the merit of their obedience. Quite on the contrary. As a summary of God's moral law, the Ten Commandments serve as a rule of life for the redeemed. And we'll talk more about that soon enough. But lastly, for this lesson, as we approach Christian ethics, it's important for us to note that the Ten Commandments are but one redemptive, historically contextualized revelation of the moral law. The moral law is summarily comprehended here in the Ten Commandments, but the moral law is also made manifest in Scripture anytime that God reveals his moral will. Anywhere that we hear God's moral commands, there his moral law is revealed to us. But the Ten Commandments are a virtually comprehensive summary of his moral law, giving attention to every area of life, from the public worship of God all the way to the personal heart piety of the believer. Yet it contains clear examples of redemptive historical conditioning as well. For example, consider the promise attached to the fifth commandment. Long life in the land of Canaan is promised to those who honor mother and father. Or think about the fourth commandment, where Israel is commanded to keep the seventh day as a Sabbath rest unto the Lord. These are examples of how the command in its substance continues, even if it changes in its forms, because we know that later on in redemptive history, it will change. The fourth commandment will change relative to the seventh day to the first day. And so there is a redemptive historical context in which these commandments are found that we need to understand and appreciate. And yet all the while understanding that God's moral law never changes through redemptive history, but in its substance always remains the same. So in the new covenant, the comprehensive summary of God's moral law takes on a new form, although the substance remains the same. The essence is the same. The form is different. Jesus says this in Matthew 22, verses 37 and 38. He says, "You shall love the Lord your God with all your heart and with all your soul and with all your mind. This is the great and first commandment, and a second is like it. You shall love your neighbor as yourself." Here, the moral law is summarized in terms of love, making clear that law obedience is fundamentally and at its core a matter of the heart. Matthew chapter 15, verse 19, "For out of the heart come evil thoughts, murder, adultery, sexual immorality, theft, false witness, slander." Now, in our next lesson, we will get into the Decalogue itself, and we'll begin to see how obedience to God's law has always been, is, and always will be a matter of the heart.